Try the mic check.
Is it okay?
Oh, good. You can hear me. Well, good evening. I have a little laryngitis, so I apologize. My voice isn't as strong as it usually is. My name is Carole Lutness. In 1963, I was 21 years old and the only white woman in the NAACP in Morgantown, West Virginia. Did I know that Morgantown was a hotbed of Ku Klux Klan activity? Did I even know what the Ku Klux Klan was? No. But there I was participating in civil rights marches through town because I learned in Sunday school that we were to love our neighbor as ourselves, and that in Girl Scouts that we were all brothers and sisters. I certainly did not learn those lessons from my family, with my father and uncle pounding the dining room table, railing about the damn niggers and the damn Jews, or my mother, who emphatically taught me that colored females could never be ladies, they were women. As a white girl growing up in Washington, D.C. in the 50s, I was confused about all these mixed messages. If I believed what Girl Scouts and Sunday school taught me, then I was going against my family. If I didn't, then I was betraying myself. So joining the NAACP was an act of defiance, which set me on my life's course to work for empowerment, equality, and justice. Was I afraid? You betcha. What if I was wrong and my parents were right? But they were not right. I have seen racism firsthand with Davy, who had a master's degree, a wonderful friend, mentor, and the assistant director of the Girl Scout camp where I worked during college. I stood in line on our days off at the colored window in Harrisonburg, Virginia, to buy food while the white people sat comfortably inside the restaurant. With her, I went up to the colored balcony to watch movies. After college, my first job was as a substitute teacher at the colored high school in Leesburg, Virginia, which allowed me to see firsthand the hypocrisy of separate but equal. The only reason the African American community even had a high school was that they had raised the money to pay for the land and building. I taught their kids, who had to share desks, and use the cast-off, torn books from the white high school. I saw their kids walking miles to school through the rain and snow while the white kids' school bus drove by. In my 30s, my African-American husband at the time, probably the safest driver I have ever known, was pulled over many times for DWB, driving while black. He and I were repeatedly seated at dark rear tables and ignored by the waitress. My African-American girlfriends were always being followed by security guards in department stores. This week, your school is marking a week of peace, hope, and justice, 150 years after President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. When you look around, you must be asking, what hope is there for peace and justice in these perilous times? I look at you and I feel sad about the burden you are going to have to assume to try to turn this sinking ship around. There are indeed sinister forces that are navigating us toward the precipice of economic, social, political, and environmental collapse. These forces don't give a damn about black people, brown people, women, children, or anyone not part of the corporate elite. We are living in a time of unbridled greed and hubris, and we better wake up or this ship is going to sink. We must stick together and not get manipulated by their ridiculous tactics used to divide us, such as gods, guns, and gays, and skin color, or some other ploy to make us blame and hate each other. Remember that King said there could be no racial justice without economic justice? How did it happen that the fabled 1% has managed in about 40 years to dismantle our march towards civil rights, economic justice, and peace? Well, it all started in 1971. Those 1%ers were not happy with what was going on. We had a strong middle class, boosted by nearly 35% union membership. We had a growing civil rights movement that promised to bring African Americans into a place that would challenge the economic social status quo, and an upper class that was furious that there was less and less gap between them and the rest of us, because they were paying high taxes of about 71%. You see, they never bought into the concept of shared responsibility, or that it was our labor that made them wealthy. Lewis Powell, then a lawyer and lobbyist for the tobacco industry, was asked by the National Chamber of Commerce to draft a white paper that would outline a plan to restore the corporate oligarchs to power. In the memo, he called for a multi-pronged approach to achieve this goal. He called for the aggressive appropriation of education, think tanks, media, politics, and the courts in order to shift public opinion and bend the political and judicial system in favor of big business. You see, the oligarchs never forgave FDR, whom they called a traitor to his class, for establishing the safety net, Social Security, unemployment, insurance, and labor Medicare for those most vulnerable in our society, for encouraging the rise of the labor movement, for regulating their businesses, and for beginning small, halting steps toward dismantling Jim Crow laws. He and his wonderful wife, Eleanor, visualized a time when there would be no color barrier. They were working against incredible forces of hatred of Southern whites and the corporate class that wanted to dismantle everything they were doing to get us out of the horrible depression which they, the oligarchs, had caused during the Roaring '20s, with the same tricks they have pulled this time that brought us into this current mess. Eleanor especially was working for racial equality. When she wanted Marian Anderson, an African American, to sing at Constitution Hall, the Daughters of the American Revolution turned her down because their concert hall was only for white performers. She openly resigned from the DAR and arranged for this famous contralto to sing at the Lincoln Memorial. So in 1939, amid a crowd of thousands, a 10-year-old Martin Luther King stood watching this groundbreaking performance. I am sure that Eleanor's courage and commitment to her principles helped shape young Martin Luther King. Many of your parents came to age during the Reagan era, and you have grown up under this, so that the corporate hijacking of our democracy, the corpocracy, seems normal and natural to you. Many of you have swallowed the corporate propaganda that unbridled capitalism is God's way, that the USA can do no wrong, and that the purpose of life is to be a good consumer. You have been taught to pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, and do not challenge the message of Disney, Comcast, Fox News, Time Warner, CBS, that control 80–90% of what you hear and see. The same is true for the printed media, radio, and the internet. We have a non-stop 24-hour cacophony of media propaganda, distraction, and consumerism blaring at us. Lewis Powell's legacy lives on in the mindless diversions such as Honey Boo Boo and who will be the next Dancing with the Stars winner. Don't be fooled. The goal is to numb your minds with television and your bodies with fast food. We We have a corporate system that tells you what to think and keeps you exhausted from working 2 or 3 jobs to pay off your student loans and your credit card bills for the crap they convince you you must have. And absolutely, they do not want you to think or read. The media especially doesn't want to tell you the truth, that the oligarchs have destroyed this economy by outsourcing and managed to redistribute the wealth so that the top 1% now controls 50% of the wealth, and the top 15% controls 85%. And the bottom 40%, that's 126 million people, disproportionately minority, controls just 0.2%. The $240 billion net income in 2012 of the richest 100 billionaires would be enough to make extreme poverty history 4 times over all over the world. We have become in the United States, increasingly all over the world, a society with only 2 classes, those who own and those who owe. Americans' children are facing a system that hardens with every budget cut and tax exemption for the rich. 42% of children born to parents in the bottom 5th of the economic distribution are stuck there as adults. Only 4% of them raised in the bottom quintile make it to the top quintile as adults. Only about 20% will make it to the top half. While 12% of white children live in poverty, 35% of Hispanic children and 39% of black children live in poverty, a number that has been steadily rising since the 80s. 80% of black children who started in or near the top half of the U.S. income levels experience downward mobility later in life. Much of minority wealth exists in home values. As a result of the housing crash, for every dollar of non-home wealth owned by white families, people of color have only 1 cent. Median wealth for a single white woman is over $40,000. For black and Hispanic women, it is a little bit over $100. The growth of the financial sector and the destruction of the New Deal programs pushed by conservatives means more poor children, which will result in more poor adults. We are fast becoming a nation of have-nots and have-yots. Americans have long believed that economic inequality is okay as long as everybody has a chance to move from one rung ladder to the next. But this accelerated rise in inequality hasn't meant more mobility, but less. What Americans are just beginning to grasp is that we are pioneering a system that may be just as inflexible as the old feudal system of landed classes. Our new system is based on access to mobile money, and it is spawning dynasties, creating closed social circles and birthing more devices for social exclusion that separate the well-to-do from the rest. Thanks to FDR, who saved capitalism by reining in corporate power with regulation and high taxes, we experienced from the mid-40s to the mid-70s the golden era of our history. We had a strong middle class because of strong unions, the best schools, outstanding infrastructure, and a booming economy. Because we taxed the rich heavily, wealth became pretty evenly distributed among the classes. Reagan changed all that by beginning a 30-year dismantling of the New Deal safety net instituting huge tax cuts for the rich, massive military buildup, deregulation, and the corporate hijacking of our political system. Before Reagan, we were in an era of the rich not being too rich and the poor not being too poor. During the civil rights era, blacks were beginning to move into the middle class, but over the last 30 or so years, nearly 1/3 of blacks are now back in poverty. Some have made it, but their grasp onto the middle class is tenuous because they don't have inherited wealth, secure home ownership, and access to the good old boys club that many white people do. So that this economic downturn has made it very hard for them to stay in the middle class. So how did the oligarchs achieve this coup d'etat? Well, remember Lewis Powell? Nixon appointed him to the Supreme Court, where in 1976, he navigated the money equals speech ruling, which unleashed a torrent of corporate money that has totally corrupted our political system and laid the groundwork for the disastrous Citizens United decision in 2010, which allows unlimited corporate spending in politics with little or no transparency. We now have 37,000 corporate lobbyists on Capitol Hill, and the revolving congressional corporate door guaranteeing that almost all of our legislators are beholden to big money and must play the game the way they're told. Witness the recent $6 billion election. I now call the Republican Party the willing wives of the corporation and the Democrats the reluctant concubines. The 1% have stolen our democracy, which is especially hard on blacks, Hispanics, and women. Remember, capitalists can only think as far as the next quarterly financial report. Their only goal is profit through new markets and cheap labor. They achieve this by plundering our resources, oil, rare earths, fish, timber, water, what have you, and they turn it into stuff that you use and then throw away. They don't seem to realize we live on a finite planet and we must be stewards of the earth. Guess what? When it's gone, it's gone. That goes for oil, rare earths. Think twice about throwing your cell phones away. Fish, air, clean water, etc. How have the corporatists gotten away with this? Well, it was in the late 19th century they cleverly corrupted the 14th Amendment, written expressly for the newly emancipated Negroes, which guaranteed, quote, all persons born in the United States, excluding Indians not taxed, were citizens and were to be given full and equal benefit of all laws. The corporatists had been trying for years to establish corporate personhood. They were fighting to be loosened from the shackles our founding fathers put on them because, as Jefferson said, I hope we shall crush it in its birth, the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial of strength and bid defiance to the laws of our country. Jefferson was a relentless critic of the monopolizing economic power by banks and corporations and those who put their faith in what our third president referred to as, quote, the selfish spirit of commerce that knows no country and feels no passion or principle but that of gain. The ploy to hijack the 14th Amendment was executed by a sleight of hand by a Supreme Court clerk in the 1886 Santa Clara versus the Railroad decision, where he inserted a headnote that said it was assumed that corporations are persons entitled to the same equal protection as any other person. This assumption has resulted in the massive destruction of our democracy, so that now corporate power supersedes the power of the people. The corporate elite stole the 14th Amendment from African Americans, which they have parlayed into this heist of our democracy, our resources, and our economy. The corporatists have allowed this prescription, followed this prescription to the T with phenomenal results. Reagan's attack on labor continues today through a constant media and legal assault on workers. There has been a dismantling and corruption of EPA environmental protection, the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, massive deregulation of big business, assaults on our safety net, the incredible bloated military-industrial complex which supports our Boeings and Pratts and Whitneys and Halliburtons and protects the United States' right to the world's oil and mineral reserves at the cost of the lives of our young people, deluded into thinking they are serving their country instead of realizing they are serving Exxon, Chevron, and Walmart. The corporate think tanks, such as the Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute, etc., spew out lies that there's no such thing as man-made climate change, and that the incarceration of millions of black and brown-skinned people is necessary, and that everyone should be free to own an assault weapon. Then we have corporate American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, boilerplate laws infecting state legislatures all over the country that furthers the corporate agenda and are responsible for the recent Michigan law that allows people to bring guns into schools, and the Florida Stand Your Ground law that resulted in innocent young black men being murdered. I'm sorry, I believe this devolving of our society into a violent John Wayne, every man for himself, survival of the fittest, is part of the corporate ploy to make us distrust each other and make us willing to accept more and more police-state tactics and loss of our civil liberties. Don't you want your habeas corpus back? We now stand on the precipice of economic, political, social, and environmental collapse because of their plunder and lack of willingness to be restrained or pay their fair share to maintain the laws and institutions that have provided stability, safety, opportunity, and justice. They have privatized, that is stolen, our commons, starved our public schools, allowed our infrastructure to decay, attacked our safety net, waged war on labor unions, vilified the poor, the disabled, the minorities, and dismantled environmental protection and the government's regulatory responsibilities. The truth is that the ugly legacy of racism, which is part of this economic assault on all of us, continues to impact the quality of life for all Americans, regardless of color. But specifically today, there are more African American adults under correctional control in prison, jail, probation, parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. More than were in prison in Stalin's gulags in Russia. Americans' prison population significantly housed in privatized for-profit prisons continues to explode, with America having a greater percentage of its people behind bars than any other nation in the world. The methodical mass incarceration of black men has led to a constant assault on the black family, the disenfranchisement of millions of people, and a new and very real era of American minority oppression. What is perhaps more problematic is that the negative attitudes about blacks are increasing. An Associated Press recent study found that the racial attitude tests The number of Americans with anti-black sentiments jumped to 56%, up from 49% during the last presidential election. A Pew Research Center poll released in 2011 found that most Southern whites think it's appropriate for modern-day politicians to praise Confederate leaders. In fact, 4 in 10 Southern whites sympathize more with the Confederacy than with the Union. There are scores of whites who feel superior to blacks, and there are scores of blacks who feel inferior to whites, with each blaming the other for the growing difficulty that all people are facing in trying to achieve this American dream. Most people seem unaware that corporate influence and wealth has taken over public policy, so that the government policy now favors the wealthy few at the expense of the people. As more government functions are privatized, we find political leaders defunding public schools, shifting government funds to the private sector, and selling off our commons to the corporate elite. Some African Americans have made gains, but most have not. Our struggle never ends. Witness the recent assault on voting rights and the attack on affirmative action. Lament the incarceration of hundreds of thousands of men of color for minor offenses, 62% of them there for soft drug offenses, while the banksters and the corporate thugs get off scot-free. Be horrified that in the inner city, our minority men are experiencing a 30 to 40% unemployment rate. Look how the corporatists, through their Tea Party toadies, have persecuted Obama, the food stamp president, and missed no opportunity to distract and separate us through blatant racism and hot-button divisive issues. And what do these titans of commerce want? These mostly white billionaire men and their political lackeys and media hirelings? They don't want much, they just want it all. They want to return us to a time of serfdom, where slaves will be waiting on their tables and picking their crops, where women will be barefoot and pregnant, where workers will be jailed for organizing, where the only children of the privileged will be educated. They chip away at our economic strength of this nation time and time again with bubbles and hedge funds and Wall Street gambling ploys, scams and thefts. But I fear this time they've really done it. They have so desecrated the environment, engaging in a drunken binge, plundering our resources, and ruined the economy that we may not get back. They may have taken us to the brink of collapse. Oh, they may come back with a few more bubbles, but the wise person sees the writing on the wall. We urgently need to unite. We cannot let them keep dividing us anymore with all the tricks and ploys they have used in the past. No more skin privilege for white folks. No more finger pointing. No more buying into the propaganda. We need to stand firm and have a moral compass and choose to allow our higher angels to direct us. For this is not just a struggle for the African American. It is a struggle for all but the very few. Give up your illusions. Chances are very good you're never going to be rich, despite what the media tries to tell you. About 70% of the super rich inherit it. About 4% marry it. About 10% are the movie stars and the athletes and celebrities. About 10% are your drug dealers and criminals, either up in Wall Street or down on the ghetto. The few who actually get rich, the Horatio Alger way, are about 1%. Yet they are held up as the American bootstrappers to emulate. If I did it, you can too. And if you don't, then there's something wrong with you. Never was there a greater crisis than we all face now economically, politically, and environmentally. Thomas Jefferson said, "The price of freedom is eternal vigilance." We must fight to create a society of inclusion, compassion, and tolerance. We have no choice. The alternative is destruction. And believe me, the plutocrats are not going to hand it over to us without a fight. We must envision a new, sustainable society that will emulate the democratic ideal. Martin Luther King, remember, said there could be no racial justice if there is not economic justice. He said, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual doom." He was a champion of collective bargaining rights, not only understood the link between the workers' rights and civil rights, but also the role of the labor movement that it plays in pushing our nation towards social and economic progress. With Michigan's recent right to work law, which I call the right to work for less law, the corporations, through ALEC and gerrymandering, continue their assault on labor. Why? Because they want cheap labor and no organized resistance. Studies show that with strong labor, all workers benefit, not just those in the unions. Remember, King was killed supporting a striking union public sanitation worker cause. There, when you first came in, that's where he was. The AFS, the American, the union, asked me, and is it an accident that all wages have remained stagnant since the 80s when Ronald Reagan first began the corporate assault on unions? We must not be fooled by them and unite to fight the forces of greed, hatred, and fear. But how do we fight these forces that are as old as Bible times, when Jesus drove the bankers, then called the money changers, from the temple, and then remember, 4 days later, they had him murdered? We fight them just as we have fought them before. We fight for social justice, peace, and stewardship of the earth in any way we can. As Joe Hill said when the oligarchs were about to kill him, "Don't mourn for me, organize." Put your money, your energy, and your efforts into whatever part of this crisis you are called to attack. If the desecration of the earth and the plundering of our resources disturbs you, then put your efforts there. If our imperialistic wars to secure the world's resources worries you, put your passion, time, and energy there. If the corruption of our political system by big money disgusts you, then get involved politically. Join the Move to Amend movement. Money is not speech. Abolish corporate personhood. Roosevelt told the people, "I agree with you. I want to do it. Now make me do it." Now we have to make President Obama do it. And if you are appalled by the injustice of pitting people against each other by using the ludicrous justification of different skin color, then fight for civil rights. Join the NAACP. They take white folks too. And if you are called to fight to restore labor's power, join a union and get active. You can become an affiliate member of the Steelworkers Union, not even have to be a steel worker. Do one of these things, or better yet, do them all. King said our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. Get active, stay active, don't give up. Don't grow complacent, cynical, nihilistic, or lazy. Vote, march, rally, write op-eds and letters to the editor. Join groups of like-minded people. Run for political office like I did in 2008. Let me say again, vote. If you don't vote, they win. As Dylan Thomas said, do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And most importantly, inform yourselves. Read books and honest magazines. Watch thoughtful television like Up with Chris Hayes, Al Jazeera, Bill Moyers. Read challenging websites like The Nation, Alternate, Truthdig, the New York Times. We are living in dangerous times. Your children and grandchildren need you to fight. We must continue raising awareness that all people are created equal, endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, regardless of race, sex, sexual orientation, color, or wealth. You must realize you are the change you seek. You are our hope. We cannot leave the world to your children and their children in the horrible shape that it's in. King taught us the arc of the moral universe is long, but bends toward justice. This is true, but not without us fighting for it. He said freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. He reminded us change does not roll out on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through the continuous struggle. And so we must straighten our backs and work for our freedom. A man cannot ride you unless your back is bent. As John Donne taught us in the 17th century, no man is an island entire unto himself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Thank you.
Just a couple minutes for some questions, if there are some burning questions in the room for Mrs. Carole Lutness. We've really been very blessed to have her story as part of MLK Chapel and just hear how her experiences have informed the type of work that she does now in giving back to the community. And I love that she's encouraging everyone to get involved and be agents of change. And you can do that on a small level and on a large level, but that there's really no excuse for us to not be working towards justice and equality for everyone. And that now today is beyond locally and nationally. That's globally as well. Any questions for Mrs. Carole Lutness before I let her sit down because she's been standing? Okay, thank you so much. What's really neat about speakers like this is that they make themselves accessible. So if you do have an interest in asking Mrs. Lutness a question, but you didn't want to do so in this crowd, you can certainly contact myself. I'm Carrie. For those of you that don't know me, I didn't introduce myself. Director for Intercultural Affairs, and I'll make sure that you guys get in touch with her. I wanted to close with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, and then I will let you guys go. It says here, like an unchecked cancer, hate corrodes the personality and eats away its vital unity. Hate destroys a man's sense of values and his objectivity. It causes him or her to describe the beautiful as ugly and the ugly as beautiful, and to confuse the true with the false and the false with the true. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a living example of light and love, the same light and love that the Lord expects from us as his children to show and demonstrate to each other. Not just to those that we have an affinity or kinship with, right, because that's easy to do, but to those that are different from us, even to those that despitefully use us. He instructs us to pray for them, to clothe them when they need clothes, to feed them when they're hungry. It is our duty to demonstrate the kind of character that King demonstrated through his life's work, the kind of character that Mrs. Carole Lutness demonstrated through her life's work, and the kind of character that each of you have the ability to demonstrate through the lives that you lead now. To love one another as you love yourself, and to stand up for injustice at all costs. Thank you for attending our annual MLK Chapel. Have a blessed evening.